Right, hello, welcome to your next GeogPod, and this one is on UK in the 21st century. So that's a topic you would have done in mid-year 10. I'm Mr. Hatchell, and we are joined by Mr. Candlin. Say hello, sir.
Hello, sir. Sorry, I'm Mr. Cadlin. How are you guys?
So today, as I said, we're going to go through the UK in the 21st century, and again, it's just an overview of the ways in which we go through the topic, and essentially, we're going to look at the broad aspects and the things you would have covered in lessons. So I'm going to get straight into it. I'm going to zoom into the certain sections that we are looking at, and we're going to start with the UK's physical characteristics. So what you'll notice when you look at this UK map here is that most of the east of the UK, so the right-hand side on the map, is lowland. Okay, so it's almost flat and it's almost at sea level. That's between 0 and 100 meters above sea level. And what you will then notice is the further west you go, so if we have a look at Wales, the southwest down near Cornwall and Devon, and if we have a look at all of the north of Scotland, you will see that they are mostly mountain ranges. And in those mountain ranges, you will find that they are mainly sparsely populated. So they don't have many people living in them because the landscape is not really very suitable to build large amounts of houses on, and therefore to have towns and cities as well. Whereas the south and east, so in our area of Shefford and most of London and also places like Norwich, they have really flat land and slightly hilly areas, which means that they are much more suited for settlements, for houses, towns and cities, as well as roads and railways. So that's why they are densely populated. They have lots of people living there. Mr. Candlin, any questions on that?
Yeah, I noticed that there's a couple of rivers. There's one down by the River Exe in Exeter, and the one up by the River Tees, and that about forms some type of line, an invisible line in between the River Tees and the River Exe, and that's called the Tees Exe line. And what they look to try to say is everything that is above that actual line is uplands, and everything underneath it is the lowlands. There are going to be some exceptions, but as a general rule of thumb, that's usually good to remember.
Yeah, excellent work there. You can see that very clearly on the map as well. And that's something that you could potentially use to try and remember the differences between the lowlands and the flatter areas and the highlands and the upland areas.
Right, so this has quite an impact on the uses of a land, doesn't it? I know you've talked about all the houses and all the roads and stuff like that, but you know, if you're going to farm, it all depends on what you want to be able to grow, really, I suppose. If you want to be able to grow lots of crops, so if you're an arable farmer, where would you build your farm, sir?
Yeah, exactly. So if we have a look at the screen as well, it leads us nicely onto this. So land use in the UK is very varied. And for example, if you're an arable farmer where we want to grow crops like Sir asked, you would grow them in the south and east because the landscape is more preferable towards growing those crops. The soil is easier to work with. And also our climate in the south and east is much more suitable to growing those types of crops because we do get generally warmer weather than, let's say, the north and west, where the mountain ranges are. So if we think about the UK mountain ranges overall, we know that the north of the UK, so most of the Scottish borders and highlands, the Grampian Mountains, for example, that those areas are very, very hard to grow crops on. The climate is more harsh, so the soil is not very good for growing those crops. And so instead, those areas mostly become just rural areas that are not really widely used.
Whereas, up on the different type of farming, though, couldn't you? So, what could you farm up there? What could you keep?
Yeah,
could you keep cows on big hills or what?
Yes, exactly. So we have what's called pastoral farming as well. And so instead, you could have what is essentially animal farming in these areas instead. And that's actually, I don't know, sir, if you've ever driven in some of these rural areas, and you will see lots of sheep and cows in the middle of nowhere, essentially, in these rural areas.
I think the sheep and the goats are usually really kind of resilient animals, and they can be able to survive it in harsh conditions. If you think about they've got the big furry coats, obviously that gives them some protection as well. But a lot of the cows aren't actually put up on the mountaintops because they're really valuable. And if they're giving milk, or if they're going to be able to give the farmer meat, they want to bring them perhaps down into the valleys a little bit, where they aren't going to get injured.
Yeah, and also then you've got the transport of all of the goods that the cows produce, the milk, and they obviously need to be transported to the facilities where it's pasteurized, etc. And then it goes out into our supermarkets where we buy it. So they need to be kind of accessible as well, don't they, sir?
Yeah, and I think as you talk about that arable actual farming there, if all those actual fields are really nice and if they're nice and flat, it's easier up onto the tractors, the combine harvesters, and all those type of pieces of machinery to be able to help to be able to do the harvest and also look after the fields.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so what we'll do then is linked inextricably to that. So it's very, very clear that population and where people live is linked to the types of landscape we've actually got. So what you will find is those mountainous areas that we've mentioned before, like much of northern Scotland, are actually very sparsely populated. So it's difficult, as I said at the start, to build houses on those areas. It's also got a more harsh climate, and therefore less people live there. And if we have a look at our Polaris map here on the right-hand side, you can see that most of Scotland, in terms of colour, is white or very light pink. And the reason for that is because if you look at the key, there is much less people living there, between 0 and let's say 500 in most places, because of those landscapes. Whereas if we look at the places that have gentle hills, that have moderate climates, like most of the east, and actually, in fact, most of England, if you look at the map, you will find that those places have a high population density. So a lot of people living in a small area. And the reason for that is because it's much easier to have the transport network there, the roads, the railways. It's easier to build the houses and so on. And then finally, there is also places that are categorized as having a very high concentrated population. So that is most of the southeast. So on your map, you have London where my mouse is now, and that's where the River Thames is. And you will see that most of the colours surrounding this area are darker. And in central London, particularly, you will have 5,000 plus population density. And the reason for that is because not only is the landscape suited to it, also there are more attractions there for people. There's more employment because the universities and big companies set up there. There's more shops. There's a bit of everything for everyone to access. So people will choose to move to these areas as well. Any questions, sir?
I think those type of areas that are actually darker are actually getting bigger over time as well. And that's that type of urban sprawl or that urbanization, is getting bigger and bigger and bigger because people want to be able to come to these big cities up on better jobs. As you said before, you can go to the theatre in the evenings, you can go to good clubs, you can go to music venues. So these actual clusters, there is now over 50% of all
Yeah.
of all the populations living in urban areas, and people can better travel into London, even from where we are, within maybe 40 minutes, and they can be able to earn all the good money that's in the cities, and then be able to live out where the living expenses are a bit lower, and it's obviously a lot greener outside, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And to pick up that point about people living outside of the actual city areas themselves, like London, if you think about places like Luton and Bedford and the surrounding areas, even like Shefford, there are quite a lot of people who live there but actually commute every day, whether that be by the train or not, to London itself, to the city centre, to actually work. And the reason they do that is as Mr. Candlin's just said, because it's actually cheaper to live outside of the very urban area, the city. But it's also then easy to commute, like for example, from Bedford on the train to the centre of London. Yeah, about 40 minutes. So it's not really a harsh commute. and people choose to do it to save money as well. And Sir mentioned finally that, yeah, about that key term there, urban sprawl. It's a really, really good key term to use, and that essentially means, yeah, the geographical spreading of a city, the enlarging of it because the population is increasing, and you have to obviously build more and more houses, and the city has to spread out geographically so that it can fit the people that want to live there in it. So London is a classic example of that, in how people in Watford, for example, nowadays, I don't know if anybody supports Watford, but people who live in Watford nowadays actually sometimes class themselves as living in London. Now, it's not a London borough, but it is very close to Harrow, for example, which is a London borough. So that spread is continuing all of the time. Brilliant. So let's just go back over to talk about kind of some of the physical factors in the UK. And this particular section is about rainfall patterns. There is something really simple here to remember.
Where are the mountains?
Go on, sir.
I said, where are the mountains? So, as we said before, most of the mountains, or the uplands, as you called them, were on left-hand side, weren't they? So
Yeah.
they were on the west and definitely on the northwest actual side. So, is there a link in between the uplands and the amount of actual rain they have?
Absolutely, there is. And that's actually the reason why, if you look at this Chord Beth map, which shows you rainfall averages, the blue colours are high amounts of rainfall, the brown colours are low amounts of rainfall. We see that where the mountainous areas are and the upland areas, the rainfall totals are much higher. Okay, so we see that, for example, in the north and west, so in most of West Scotland, in some of Wales and some of northwest England around Cumbria, we see that rainfall averages are around 2,000 or 2,500 millimeters every year. Now, in contrast, very differently, in the east and southeast, so in our area, for example, we don't have those vast mountain ranges. And actually, we only have average rainfall of between 500 and, let's say, 800 millimeters of rainfall every year. So there is much lower rainfall where there is less mountain ranges. And the reason for that, go on, sir.
No.
The reason for that is because those mountainous areas create what's called relief rainfall. And relief rainfall is all to do with the shape of the landscape. So the word relief actually means landscape or shape of land in geography. And where we've got, and you can see on the diagram here, where we've got mountain ranges or high hill areas, what happens is warm air blows towards that mountain range, and it has to rise above that mountain range. So the air moved upwards. And as the air moves upwards into the atmosphere and over that mountain range, it has to cool down. And when air cools down, essentially what it does is it starts to create what's called condensation. So, sir, have you ever gone out to your car in the morning and it hasn't rained, but the car is very wet? Sir? Mr. Candlin's, I might have lost Mr. Candlin very briefly, but essentially what happens is when you go out into your car in the morning, some of you may have seen this, essentially what happens is the car becomes wet overnight, and that's because condensation's been created. And what that means is essentially the water vapor in the atmosphere, the water in the atmosphere has essentially built up on surfaces like on the grass or on your car. And what happens in the atmosphere is, over a mountain range, is that water vapor creates clouds, which you can see in this diagram, and those clouds create rainfall. Now, when the air moves back down the other mountainside after it's rained, we have what's called a rain shadow. And a rain shadow is where actually it receives much less rainfall. So you can see it's called the dry east on this diagram. And it receives much less rainfall because all of the water vapor that was in the air has actually already emptied itself on the mountain range. So there is much less rainfall in those areas. So that essentially is a roundup of UK relief rainfall, and relief rainfall essentially exists because there is mountain ranges. So let's move on to the population. Oh, hello, sir. We were just
again,
talking.
Sir.
We just went
again.
through relief rainfall.
I lost you in the Wi-Fi. Yeah. So, is there a pattern then in between? I mean, it looks like everyone wants up on to be able to live, but where there's no rain. That's going to cause some problems, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason they want to live there is because obviously you want to have nice summer days and you feel much better when you're in a place with less rainfall. But it does create major problems. And it creates problems in what's called water stress. So water stress is when areas have limited supply of water. And essentially, if you have lots and lots of people moving to an area like the south or east in the UK, which receive less rainfall, you are going to have more demand than there is supply of water. And what that essentially means is more people want to use water, but there is less water available. So
Yeah, but there's
rainfall is,
loads of water around, so isn't there? There's loads of rain. We get loads of rain, and then we've got all the rivers. It must be easy to tap into that.
well, you say that. So if we think about the north and west, so again, Scotland and Wales particularly, um, they get lots of rainfall. They get very high amounts of rainfall. And somewhere like Scotland is very sparsely populated. So its demand is much lower than its supply. And so Scotland has a big surplus in the amount of water it has. However, in the south and east, people do say we get a lot of rainfall, but that rainfall total is nowhere near what's needed to be able to supply us with the water we use. And there's also the case that we actually demand in the south and east, somewhere like London, demands a lot more water than somewhere like Cumbria or Carlisle in the northwest. So even though we do feel like we get lots of rainfall, it's definitely much drier than it should be for us to be demanding this amount of water. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, yeah, it does. I mean, I remember growing up, and we had one bathroom, and
Yeah.
therefore we probably didn't be able to use that much water. But now uh, I'm a little bit older, and all the houses, have up on 2 to 3 bathrooms, and they have like 2 to 3 showers, and a massive bath, a dishwasher, a washing machine, and we're using a lot more water now. That's not going to help, is it?
No, absolutely, and that's actually the biggest problem in the UK we've got. So, and exactly as you just said, we have more appliances than ever that use more water: dishwashers, washing machines, large baths, and so on. And all of these things are using water constantly. And the more people we have in a household as well, the higher the amount of water demand there will be. And so, one of the problems we've got then in the UK is, as we've just mentioned, we've got domestic demand, which is high. In other words, more people in houses demanding more water, particularly, as I mentioned before, in the south and east. So in our area of Shefford and Clifton, or in London, and so on. So we've got high demand, but we've got lower supply than in the north and west. And some of the solutions that have been tried and are in progress in terms of being implemented are things like constructing new reservoirs. So there's currently a proposal, for example, in Abingdon, which is in Oxfordshire, for a very large water reservoir that can store hundreds and hundreds of thousands of liters of water that we can basically store for when we need it. However, people obviously have opposition to this type of thing because it means that their house has to go and they have to move elsewhere to build a reservoir. We've also got the idea of transferring water from wetter to drier areas. So there was also a proposed transfer scheme of a massive pipeline being built from Scotland right the way down towards the southeast of England to basically move the surplus water from Scotland to where it was really needed in the southeast of England. But this
That would
involves,
be massive.
yeah, exactly. This
I know there's
involves,
one
go on.
in Birmingham. The water authority there is called Severn Trent, and they built this a huge pipeline all the way up on from one of the lakes that was in North Wales, and they made this lake into a really big dam, and they just be able to get all the water up from North Wales, and that's worked really, really well.
Yeah, and that's an example of a solution that does work really well. And what's happened is basically the UK government and the water authorities have tried to think long term about this. In 50 years, as climate change continues and as the southeast potentially gets drier and drier, and as the north and west potentially actually gets stormier, so there might be more rainfall initially, we need to think about population and how we solve these problems. And those pipelines, like you mentioned, the Birmingham and North Wales transfer project there, these can be a solution, but they do involve a lot of investment and a clear commitment to do it. And also it involves people consenting who live in the areas that the pipeline might go through to having these pipelines. So it is a fine balance between people's needs and also trying to plan for the future for the increasing population as well.
Right, I've got that, sir.
Brilliant. So we're going to talk about, just mentioned it there, population in general in the UK. So the current population is around 65 million people and it's still rising. And it's rising due to a number of things like natural increase, but also net migration as well. And we know that the amount of people that actually are living older is increasing too. So people are living longer. Naturally, in the UK, there is more births than deaths happening more and more. And so, therefore, what's happening is the population is very slightly naturally growing, very slightly. It's not massive. But there is also migration. So the amount of people wanting to move to the UK as well is increasing. And so this all means that our population is growing. And it's predicted that our population overall will reach 70 million by 2030. So that would be a 5 million rise in, let's say, 10 or 15 years. That's a very, very quick rise in population. And
That's
so,
massive, sir. Are we going to need
yeah,
more houses? How many more
yeah.
houses are we going to need, do you reckon, a year?
Well, currently, we need 240,000 homes a year to be built
Wow.
to meet current demand. That's current demand. And so, therefore, if we want to try and, let's say, meet demand in 15 years' time, that number is going to actually increase towards 300,000. And the problem is we are actually only building between, and it varies every year, but between 120 and 180,000 homes a year. So actually, we are currently building nowhere near the amount we need for the future. And this is going to lead to massive problems, and we already have these problems in terms of things like rent amounts going up, house prices increasing because the demand is much higher. And one of the reasons that we have this problem in the amount of homes being built is because we've got people in areas that are opposed to new housing developments because they think it may impact their community in a negative way. We've also got the greenbelt areas, the areas of the UK that are rural and are protected by government law and legislation. And these areas can't be built on unless the government change the law to allow them to be built on. But they stop these urban areas, towns and cities actually sprawling further to be able to hold more people in. So they are really the problems and the reasons behind us not being able to build currently enough homes for the population. So, any questions?
I remember why my granddad used to say, not in my backyard. So I think that attitude where people didn't want their, all their the local parks and all their local fields, to be taken away from them. But everyone needs to be able to change their upon their attitude, don't they? And also, I think that we're getting lazier, as human beings. I mean, like if I was to ask all these year 11s now who does any washing up, I imagine the hands will go straight down. So we have to be up on to try and change our behaviours every day. If we wash up in an actual bowl, it's going to be save much more money and much more water than if you used a actual dishwasher that is on for maybe 2 hours or so.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. And so, for example, as you mentioned, the washing up with, for example, just fill the sink and use that water to wash all of the dishes. They don't need rinsing off. They can dry on a draining rack. When you brush your teeth, Okay, some people have a habit of turning the tap on and leaving the tap running while they brush their teeth. That is using liters and liters of clean water. Not only do we have to pay for that because you have water charges for each household, but also it's a wasteful practice where we actually need to be conserving water as much as possible. And going back to the housing problem, you mentioned the not in my backyard theory. And that's, short for that is NIMBY, NIMBY. And yeah, there is a lot of people who have this NIMBY attitude where they agree that more houses need to be built, but they then say, but nowhere near me, not in my backyard. And so that's a problem for us in terms of meeting the demand of housing in future. There's one final thing just to cover in this session, and that is the demographic transition model. And this relates to what we were talking about here on the center of your screen now about population increase and how the population changes over time. So the demographic transition model, otherwise known as the DTM, is this graph which is sideways on your screen on the right hand side. And it basically looks at birth rates, the amount of people being born per 1,000, death rates, the amount of people dying per 1,000, and also total population added together. And so what it does is it describes basically in 5 stages, the stages a country goes through in history and development in terms of its population. And so those 5 stages are actually really important to try and pinpoint where a country is in terms of its level of development. So the UK is currently in stage 4, and actually sometimes it moves into stage 5. So stage 4 is where birth rate and death rate are both low. So there's not loads and loads of births, and there's not loads and loads of deaths. They're around the same. And therefore, natural increase, there are very little changes to it. It goes up and it slightly goes down. So in other words, the population is roughly stable. It's not dramatically increasing, it just fluctuates up and down slightly over time. But if we look backward in history, and if we look at some of the poorer nations of the world, we will find that they are in stage 2 and 3, for example. Now, there are very little nations in stage 1, okay? Because most nations have made some economic progress. So there's very little nations that have really high birth rates and death rates that are really high as well. Because most nations have progressed towards stage 2 and 3. And stage 2, for example, is where we have birth rates are high, so there are lots of children being born, and these may be nations where contraception and education isn't very good at the moment. And so what's happening is more and more people are having children, and the death rate is falling rapidly. And the reason the death rate might fall rapidly in a nation is because of healthcare changes. It's because education is helping doctors and nurses be able to treat people with illnesses. So natural change essentially is increasing. The population does start to grow rapidly because there are really high births and low deaths. And stage 3 is similar in the sense that population is still growing rapidly, but what happened is as well, the birth rates start to fall too. So actually what we're getting is the natural increase or the population growth is going to slow too. It's going to go into stage 4 and start to slow. And then finally, stage 5, places like Japan and Germany are in stage 5 currently. And what that means is the birth rate actually falls slightly below the death rate. So in other words...
No, sir, I think...
Go on.
I think I'm all done on that, on the DTM. I think,
Got it?
I reckon... Yep, and the
brilliant
Wi-Fi is just hanging in.
Yeah, the Wi-Fi keeps cutting out. So what we'll do
there
is,
as well.
Yeah, we'll end there, right? Hopefully that was useful.
Sorry, listeners.
That's all right. We'll end there, and hopefully that was useful to you all. And this was the first stage, if you like, of the UK in the 21st century. The next GeogPod will be on the second half of UK in the 21st century.